This isn't your typical rude customer gets put in their place story. This is about Eduardo, a waiter at a fancy resort, who had to deal with the worst kind of tourists, the entitled, condescending, I'm better than you type. But it's also about more than that. It's about dignity, hidden depths, and the surprising turns life can take. The laughter was loud, too loud. It grated, like fingernails on a chalkboard, totally out of place in the otherwise peaceful, open-air restaurant at the far end of the resort. Eduardo, wiping down a table with the smooth, practiced movements of someone who'd done this a million times, tried to ignore it. He'd worked here for years, seen it all, the rudeness, the insults, the barely concealed contempt. He'd learned to plaster on a smile, to be the perfect, invisible servant. But tonight felt different. A group of tourists had basically exploded into the restaurant. All sunburned skin, expensive clothes, and that air of entitlement that just screamed, I own this place. The ringleader, a guy with shoulders that barely fit through the doorway and a floral shirt unbuttoned way too low, surveyed the scene with a smirk. Man, this place is… what's the word? Authentic? Yeah, basic. Definitely basic. Laughter erupted. His friends, a collection of equally obnoxious characters, joined in. A blonde woman with sunglasses that probably cost more than Eduardo's monthly salary leaned in. I just hope they actually understand English here. Last night's staff could barely string a sentence together. More laughter, sharp and cruel. Eduardo clenched the cleaning cloth in his hand, but his face remained a perfect mask. Years of practice. He straightened, tucked his notepad under his arm, and walked towards them, the picture of calm professionalism. Good evening, sir. Welcome to the restaurant. May I take your order? The leader, let's call him Chad, because he just looked like a Chad, smirked, exchanging a look with his friends before leaning forward, condescendingly slow. Oh sure, we want a menu. Can you understand that? The table burst into giggles, like a bunch of overgrown schoolchildren elbowing each other. Eduardo didn't flinch. He dealt with worse. Of course, sir. Here is your menu. Chad barely glanced at it before tossing it back onto the table. Man, this menu's a mess. What even is this stuff? The blonde woman wrinkled her nose. Do you guys have anything normal? Or is it all just rice and like weird fish? Another guy, this one with a backwards baseball cap, because of course, chimed in. Yeah, I don't want to end up with some funky street food disease. The laughter rang out, and it felt like a slap in the face. Eduardo's grip on his pen tightened. We have several international options, including… Eduardo started, trying to maintain his composure. Just get us burgers and fries, Chad interrupted. Something safe, okay? And make sure it's not, Filipino style. The blonde woman gasped, dramatically covering her mouth as she giggled. The others followed suit, a chorus of entitled amusement. Eduardo nodded, writing down the order. Understood, sir. Your food will be ready shortly. As he turned to leave, Chad called out again, Hey, what's your name, buddy? Eduardo, sir. Chad leaned back in his chair, grinning like he'd just won the lottery. Eduardo, man. That sounds so… local. No offense, Eid. But we thought you guys would have easier names. His friends howled with laughter. Eduardo didn't react, didn't blink, didn't let them see what they had just awakened. He turned and walked away, but something had shifted. Tonight, Eduardo was done being silent. The tourists weren't just loud. They were getting worse. Eduardo kept his hands steady as he carried a tray of drinks to a nearby table. But behind him, the arrogant voices grew sharper, their laughter more cutting. Hey, look at him, Chad snickered, his voice carrying across the restaurant. Man, I swear these guys all look the same. Bet they're all named Eduardo, too. His friends erupted into laughter. The blonde woman stirred her cocktail lazily, smirking. I read something once about how these guys worship foreigners. They'll do anything for a tip. The backwards cap guy chuckled. Yeah, dude, I heard that too. I bet you could drop $5, and they'd act like you just changed their lives. Chad leaned back in his chair, calling out loudly, "Hey, Eid! How much do you make, man?" "Couple bucks a day." Eduardo kept walking towards the kitchen. He'd spent years training himself to ignore people like this, to stay calm, to be invisible. He'd almost reached the door when he heard it. "I bet he doesn't even understand us," the woman whispered loudly, though everyone could clearly hear. "Probably just nods and smiles like they all do." Chad grinned. "Oh, I bet he understands. Just too scared to say anything. Right, Eid?" Laughter. A chorus of mocking voices. Eduardo stopped. Not visibly, just for half a second. A flicker. Then, he pushed open the kitchen door and walked inside. The moment he was out of sight, Carlos, a young waiter with fire in his eyes, was in his face. "Bro, what the hell is wrong with those guys?" Eduardo placed the tray down carefully, straightening the glasses. "Nothing I haven't heard before." Carlos scoffed. "And that's just okay?" Eduardo turned to him, his voice steady. "I didn't say that." Carlos narrowed his eyes. "So what are you going to do? Just take it?" Eduardo wiped his hands on a towel, exhaling slowly. "Not forever." Carlos frowned. "You mean before?" The kitchen door swung open. The manager stepped in, looking uneasy. "Eduardo," he said quickly. "One of the guests, Chad. He's asking for you." Carlos clenched his jaw. "Of course he is." Eduardo nodded. He didn't hesitate, didn't show anything, just picked up his tray and walked back out. The tourists were still laughing as he approached. Chad grinned at him, waving a 5 peso coin between his fingers. "Hey, Eid. Here, buddy. You want to, I don't know, buy a house with this?" His friends howled with laughter. Eduardo looked down at the coin in Chad's fingers. He didn't blink, didn't move. Chad leaned closer, still smirking. "Or, do you want to beg for it?" The laughter roared. Eduardo slowly met Chad's eyes. His expression didn't change, but something in the air shifted. Then, for the first time that night, Eduardo smiled. It was small, polite, but deliberate. Chad's smirk faltered, just for a second. The laughter around the table dimmed, like they weren't sure if Eduardo was in on the joke, or if something had just changed. Eduardo reached out slowly, picked up the 5 peso coin from Chad's fingers, and flipped it once in the air. The metal caught the light as it spun before landing back in his palm. Then, without a word, he set it down gently on the table. Chad raised an eyebrow. "What? Too good for a tip now?" Eduardo clasped his hands behind his back, still calm. "I appreciate the gesture, sir," he said, his voice steady. "But I wouldn't want to take advantage of your generosity." Carlos, watching from the side, almost choked. Chad blinked. His friends looked at each other, unsure whether Eduardo was mocking him or just being an overly polite waiter. But Eduardo was already turning away. As he walked back toward the kitchen, Carlos caught up with him, grinning. Okay, I don't know what just happened, but that was legendary." Eduardo exhaled, pressing his hands against the counter. "They don't matter." Carlos scoffed. "Yeah, 'cause they seem to be making it their life's mission to push you." Eduardo stayed silent. Carlos studied him for a moment, then folded his arms. "You know, man, I don't get it. You're different. You don't just walk like the other waiters. You move like—" Eduardo turned slightly. "Like what?" Carlos shrugged. "Like someone who used to be something else." Eduardo went still. Carlos, scratching the side of his neck. "Okay, I know that sounded weird, but you ever gonna tell me why you're really here?" For the first time that night, Eduardo let his guard down just a little. He reached into his pocket and pulled out something small, worn. A university ID. Carlos squinted. "Bro, what?" Then his eyes widened. The name on the ID read, Eduardo Ramirez, Professor of Linguistics. Carlos stared. "You were a professor?" Eduardo tucked the ID away, speaking quietly. "I was." Carlos gawked at him. "How the hell did you go from that to this?" Eduardo exhaled slowly. "Life happened." Carlos ran a hand over his face. You're telling me you... He stopped, eyes darting back to the dining area. Wait, you speak perfect English, don't you? Eduardo didn't answer. Carlos laughed in disbelief. They think you don't understand them, don't they? Oh man. Oh, this is going to be good. He nudged Eduardo. So, what now, Professor? Eduardo looked toward the dining area. Chad and his group were still laughing, still basking in their own arrogance. Eduardo's jaw tightened. He had planned to ignore them, he really had. But maybe, just maybe, it was time to teach them a lesson. The laughter at Chad's table hadn't died down. If anything, it had gotten worse. Eduardo moved with the same calm grace as always, setting down plates, refilling glasses, never once showing what he was thinking. But inside, something had shifted. Chad took a huge bite of his burger and grimaced. Oh man, this is disgusting, he said, chewing exaggeratedly. This beef tastes weird. What is this, dog meat? His friends burst out laughing. The woman wiped her mouth dramatically. Honestly, I don't even know why we came here. This country is a joke. Everyone here just wants our money. Eduardo placed another tray down carefully, ignoring the heat rising in his chest. Chad leaned back, stretching. I mean, can you blame him? These guys probably make, what, $5 a day. No wonder they worship foreigners. He turned his gaze to Eduardo, grinning. Hey, Eid. That's right, huh? You'd do anything for a tip, wouldn't you? Eduardo finally met his eyes. For the first time all night, he let the silence stretch. Something about it unsettled Chad. His smirk twitched slightly. The woman snickered. Maybe he really doesn't understand us. Chad waved a hand. Nah, he does. He's just polite. He leaned forward. Right, Eid? You're just a polite little waiter, aren't you? I mean, what else could you be? You guys don't exactly have much going for you. Bet none of you even go to college. His friends laughed again. Eduardo's grip on the tray tightened. Carlos, watching from the kitchen, muttered a curse. Then, Chad said something Eduardo couldn't ignore. You know what I don't get? How these people are just okay with being nobodies. He laughed, shaking his head. I mean, what's the big dream here? Eid. Huh? Work hard, maybe save up enough to buy a... What? A little fishing boat. He smirked. Like, be honest, man. You ever even left this island? He paused. Wait, do you even know how to speak proper English? Silence. A heavy, loaded silence. Eduardo set down his tray. The entire table went still. Then he spoke. I know 27 dialects and 7 languages. Chad froze. Eduardo's voice was crystal clear, fluent, perfectly enunciated. Not a trace of an accent. The woman's fork clattered against her plate. Chad blinked. What? Eduardo clasped his hands behind his back, his expression unreadable. I said, he repeated, smoothly, effortlessly. I know 27 dialects and 7 languages. The table was dead silent. You seem curious, Eduardo continued, his voice even. Would you like me to translate what you've been saying in French? Or German? Or perhaps Mandarin? Chad's jaw tightened. The woman looked horrified. Carlos, watching from the kitchen, had to cover his mouth to keep from laughing. Eduardo let the silence stretch. Then, with calm precision, he pulled something from his pocket, his old university ID. He placed it on the table, face up. The words were clear, Professor of Linguistics. Chad's face turned red. Edward smiled politely. Does that answer your question? The entire restaurant had gone quiet. Other guests were staring. Even the waitstaff had stopped moving. Chad pushed back his chair. This is ridiculous. Eduardo tilted his head. What's ridiculous? Chad's mouth opened, then closed. His friends weren't laughing anymore. Eduardo picked up the 5-peso coin Chad had mocked him with earlier. He flipped it once in the air, then placed it gently back on the table. You can keep this, he said softly. Seems like you need it more than I do. A single chuckle came from the kitchen. Carlos had officially lost it. The woman grabbed her bag. I think we should go. The others scrambled to stand. Chad glared at Eduardo one last time, but there was nothing he could say. He turned, storming toward the exit, and behind him, the entire restaurant erupted into applause. The applause rolled through the restaurant like a slow-moving wave. At first, just a few claps, hesitant, uncertain, then more, a ripple of approval, a roar of appreciation. The guests at nearby tables grinned, nodding at Eduardo with respect. Some even raised their glasses in his direction. Chad's steps faltered. He turned sharply, eyes flashing with embarrassment. "Oh, what now? You guys are all against me." The woman in his group, her face flushed, grabbed her purse and whispered, "Just go, Chad." He wasn't having it. "Go!" Chad spun back toward Eduardo, forcing out a laugh. "Dude, you think you're some kind of hero? Some genius waiter who just put me in my place." He scoffed. "Newsflash, Ed, you're still just a guy serving food. You're still beneath me." Silence. Eduardo didn't flinch, didn't move. Then he smiled. "Funny," he said, tilting his head slightly. "I was just thinking the same thing about you." A chuckle from the kitchen. Carlos had officially stopped pretending to work. Chad's jaw clenched. You want to say that again?" Eduardo didn't need to. The tension in the air was suffocating. The other guests watched closely, some shaking their heads at Chad in disgust. A few pulled out their phones, recording the scene. The resort manager finally stepped in. "Sir," he said, addressing Chad with forced calm, "we have a policy against guests harassing our staff. I'm going to have to ask you to leave." Chad laughed bitterly. "You're kicking me out? Over him? Are you serious?" The manager folded his arms. "Extremely." The woman in Chad's group yanked his sleeve. "Let's just go, Chad." "Enough." Chad's fingers twitched. His whole body vibrated with rage. He wanted to win, wanted to wipe that damn polite smile off Eduardo's face. But he couldn't, because Eduardo wasn't fighting him. He wasn't shouting, wasn't losing control. He was just existing, and somehow that was infinitely worse. Chad exhaled sharply, snatched his sunglasses off the table. "You know what?" His voice was tight. "This place sucks anyway." He stormed toward the exit, his friends trailing behind, heads lowered in shame. The moment the door swung shut behind them, the restaurant erupted into cheers. Eduardo exhaled, shoulders relaxing. He hadn't realized how many people had been watching. An elderly couple smiled warmly at him. A businessman at the bar clapped him on the back. "You handled that with class, son," the man said, grinning. "Damn good to see." A woman at a corner table raised her glass to Eduardo. The restaurant cheered. Carlos rushed forward, practically bouncing with excitement. Bro, that was insane." Eduardo chuckled softly, shaking his head. "It was nothing." Carlos gawked at him. "Nothing? Dude, you just verbally obliterated that guy in front of a live audience. People are going to be telling this story for years." The resort owner himself, an older, well-dressed man, stepped into the dining area, arms folded, expression unreadable. Eduardo straightened immediately. "Sir." The owner studied him for a moment. Then, to Eduardo's shock, he smiled. "Follow me," the owner said. "We need to talk." Carlos gasped. "Oh my God. You're getting promoted." Eduardo blinked. "Wait, what?" Carlos grabbed his shoulders. "Dude, if you don't take me with you, I swear I'll." "Carlos," Eduardo said, laughing. Carlos threw up his hands. Fine. But when you become manager, I expect unlimited free mango shakes." Eduardo shook his head, still in disbelief. A promotion? A real chance to change everything? Maybe, just maybe, tonight had been worth it. Eduardo followed the resort owner through the restaurant, his mind still racing. Was this really happening? They stepped into the private lounge, away from the clatter of dishes and the murmurs of guests still buzzing about the scene. The owner turned, studying Eduardo with sharp, assessing eyes. "I've been watching you," he said. "For a long time." Eduardo stood tall, hands clasped behind his back. "Sir, you handle yourself differently from the others," the owner continued. "You carry yourself like someone who's used to being in charge, yet you never make others feel small. That's rare." Eduardo didn't know what to say. He had spent so long blending into the background, swallowing his pride, doing what needed to be done to survive. The owner leaned against his desk. "Tell me something, Eduardo. Why are you here? A man with your intelligence, your education. Why are you waiting tables?" Eduardo hesitated. No one had ever asked him that before. He exhaled slowly. "My family needed me," he admitted. "I had a career once, a different life. But sometimes, life doesn't wait for the perfect moment. It just happens. And when it does, you do what you have to do." The owner nodded, as if he had expected that answer. "I respect that." He picked up a folder from his desk and slid it toward Eduardo. "I was looking for someone to take over as supervisor for the resort. I think you'd be perfect for the role." Eduardo's breath hitched. A supervisor? He had expected a simple thank you, maybe a small raise if he was lucky. But this was an entirely new life. "Sir," he started, his voice careful. I don't know what to say." "Say yes," the owner said simply. "You've earned it." Eduardo looked down at the papers. His hands trembled slightly as he touched them. A real salary, a position of leadership, a chance to give his family the life they deserved. He swallowed the lump in his throat and looked up, eyes steady. "Then my answer is yes." The owner grinned. "Good. I expect great things from you, Eduardo." As Eduardo stepped out of the office, the weight on his shoulders felt lighter. Carlos was waiting just outside, bouncing on his heels. So? Eduardo couldn't stop the smile from spreading across his face. "I got the job," Carlos screamed. Dude, you're officially my boss." "Which means," he gasped dramatically, "you can't fire me because we're best friends now." Eduardo laughed, shaking his head. "Carlos, nope, too late. This is destiny. You and me, bro, running this place together." Eduardo chuckled, feeling something he hadn't felt in a long time. Hope. Maybe things were finally turning around. Maybe, after everything, this was just the beginning. The sun had dipped lower over the ocean, casting warm orange hues across the resort. The once bustling restaurant had settled into a peaceful rhythm, the clinking of glasses and soft conversation blending with the waves. Eduardo stood near the bar, still absorbing the reality of what had just happened. Supervisor. The word felt surreal. He had spent years believing his best days were behind him, that he had buried his old life for good. And yet, here he was. Carlos, still buzzing with excitement, leaned on the counter beside him. Okay, serious question. Does this mean I get a raise, too?" Eduardo smirked. "You get to keep your job, Carlos. That's already a gift." Carlos gasped, clutching his chest. "Wow, power has already corrupted you." Before Eduardo could respond, a wealthy-looking foreigner stepped up to the bar, adjusting his blazer. He had been one of the guests watching the entire scene with Chad earlier. "Excuse me," the man said, setting down his drink. "Are you Eduardo?" Eduardo straightened. "Yes, sir." The man smiled, extending a hand. "Name's Richard Clark. I run an international business consultancy. I couldn't help but overhear, well, everything." Eduardo shook his hand, curiosity flickering in his eyes. "I hope it wasn't too disruptive for your evening, sir." "Disruptive?" Richard let out a low chuckle. "Son, that was the best entertainment I've had in years. But more importantly, I saw something rare tonight." Eduardo waited, listening. Richard leaned forward slightly. "You didn't just put that arrogant fool in his place. You did it with grace, with intelligence. You didn't need to raise your voice or throw a tantrum. You controlled the entire room just by standing your ground." Carlos whispered dramatically, "Told you, bro, legendary." Eduardo chuckled softly, shaking his head. "I was just doing my job, sir." "Maybe," Richard said, nodding, "but I see leadership when it's right in front of me." He pulled out a business card and slid it across the counter. Eduardo hesitated before picking it up. Richard smiled. I have an opening in my company for someone exactly like you. Someone who can think on their feet, handle pressure, and command respect without demanding it. The job's in Manila. Comes with a six-figure salary and a team under you. Carlos choked on his own breath. A six-figure? Eduardo's fingers tightened around the card. A six-figure salary? In a city with endless opportunities? Richard took a sip of his drink, watching him carefully. No rush to decide. But I'd be an idiot if I let someone like you stay hidden in a restaurant when you should be running things. He tapped the bar twice and stood. Think about it, Eduardo. When you're ready, give me a call. As the businessman walked away, Carlos grabbed Eduardo's shoulders and shook him violently. Dude, do you understand what just happened? Eduardo stared at the card in his hand. For the first time in years, he wasn't just surviving. He was about to start living. The ocean breeze swept through the restaurant, carrying the last echoes of laughter and conversation as guests slowly drifted out for the night. The air felt lighter, as if something heavy had finally been lifted. Eduardo stood near the entrance, staring at the business card in his hand. 6 figures, a new life, a chance to step back into the world he had once belonged to. Carlos, still buzzing from excitement, waved a hand in front of Eduardo's face. Hello? Earth to future CEO? Are you even hearing me right now? Eduardo blinked, shaking his head with a chuckle. I hear you, Carlos. Carlos grinned. Good, because I'm saying, dude, you made it. Eduardo exhaled, slipping the card into his pocket. I don't know if I've made it yet. Carlos scoffed. Bro, you just got promoted, humiliated the worst customer of all time, and got a 6-figure job offer. All in the same night. If that's not making it, I don't know what is. Eduardo smiled. Maybe Carlos was right. As they stood there, the resort manager walked up, looking relieved. Eduardo. Sir. Eduardo said, standing straight. I just wanted to say, you handled yourself with professionalism tonight, the manager said. People have been talking. Guests are impressed. The staff feels proud. What you did. It mattered. Eduardo gave a small nod. Thank you, sir. The manager hesitated before lowering his voice. And between you and me, Chad and his friends, permanently banned. The owner made sure of it. Carlos fist-pumped the air. Justice. Eduardo chuckled. That's good to hear. The manager clapped him on the shoulder. Now go home. Get some rest. Something tells me big things are ahead for you. Eduardo nodded. As the manager walked away, Eduardo looked out at the ocean. The waves moved in steady rhythms, the same way they had since the beginning of time. But tonight, something felt different. Carlos stretched. So, boss, what's the plan? Eduardo thought for a long moment. I'm going to sleep, he said with a grin. And tomorrow, I'll decide what comes next. Carlos nodded, then paused. Wait, if you take the 6-figure job, does that mean I get promoted too? Eduardo burst out laughing, shaking his head. Go home, Carlos. Carlos groaned. Fine, but remember, I was your #1 supporter. When you're rich, I expect free food for life. Eduardo just smiled. As he walked home that night, past the familiar streets, past the small local vendors and twinkling city lights, Eduardo felt something he hadn't felt in a long time. Dignity, purpose, and above all, the knowledge that respect is something you earn, not demand. Because true power isn't in wealth or arrogance or belittling others. True power is in knowing who you are. And Eduardo, he was finally ready to step into the life he deserved.